And welcome again to the CDFM study group. My name is Helen Thomas, and today what I'm going to be covering is the CDFM Module 2.1 Federal Budget Process. And what I want to do is provide a better visual for you to see the different steps in the process, the key individuals involved, and how these steps and processes come together to make the federal budget process. So the slides and the items will come in one at a time, and I will explain them to you as such. So let's begin. So the first thing in the federal budget process we need to know is the operational chain of command runs from President to Secretary of Defense to the combatant commands. The importance of that is because that's how our resources are tailored. So all our budget, our manpower resources are tailored to meet the needs of those combatant commanders. So the budget process starts at the top with the National Security Council. And the council is made up of the President, the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy and Water, and it has some advisors. There are additional members such as the Treasury that sits on the National Security Council, but the primary members are listed right here, as you can see. And then the two advisors is the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the Director of Intelligence. So they provide, you could say these are the subject matter expert on the military and in the intelligence field. So what does the National Security Council give us? The National Security Council is responsible for analyzing the status of the country, the nation. They want to know what type of threat does our country face, or even our allies, because again, we participate in helping our allies. So we need to know what's going on in their area and what physical threat does our country face. So once we know the threat and the national security members identify the threat, then priorities and strategy is put into place to understand how to meet and defeat that threat. So that National Security Council develops the National Security Strategy document, the National Security Strategy. So you can look at the NSS here as a large operational order. It tells what our higher commands focus is, what their strategy, priorities, and what needs to be done by subordinate organizations. So what the Department of Defense does is then look at the national security strategy and determine what are the defense-related things that we need to do to be able to meet that big up order, national security strategy. So the DoD, or the Secretary of Defense, utilizes three systems to be able to do that budget process, to make sure that things are funded, things are resourced in a timely manner so that when they are needed, we have them in place. So the three DoD support systems are, and learn them in this order, and I'll tell you why in a minute. JCIDS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution, PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System. These three systems overlaps many times because depending on what the capability needs are, we may not already have it in our inventory. We may need to go to our acquisition system to get it, but we'll get there. So let's talk about JCIDS. The Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. What that JCIDS is a system of analysis that are done. So once we know what the national security strategy is, we need to start looking at our internal assets. What's our internal capability to be able to meet that national security strategy? So the JSIDS system is used to identify what do we have, what capabilities do we already have, and what are we missing? What's the capability gap that's missing? So when they do the JSIDS analysis, they look at the .mlpf. And what that stands for, make sure you know what all your acronyms stand for. That's they look at doctrine. Do we just need to change our doctrine? Is it in our organizational structures? Is it our TDAs or TONE documents? Is it training? Maybe we need to change or enhance our training. Again, we're trying to solve the problem. Don't just bring a problem, identify that we have a problem or a capability gap. They need to find out where exactly is that capability gap. So they also look at material. So that's, you can look at material as your equipment. They look at our leadership structure, our personnel, the rank structure, the type of MOS or whatever, personnel, and then look at the types of facility. So JSIDS is a systematic method used by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So let's not forget who one of the primary advisors were up here, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So under the chairman, you have Joint Chiefs of Staff for the services. Army has one, Navy, and so forth. So that's what we're talking about. So this is a systematic method used by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to assess capability gaps in military warfighting capabilities. So remember, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff provides an assessment of those capability gaps, and then once JSIDS is completed, then there's a recommendation on what needs to be done to fill the gap. So again, they're looking at the .mlpf, going through each one of those, analyzing the current capability that is necessary to meet and defeat our enemies in the national security strategy. So then who is responsible for the JSIDS system? The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who works for this guy, is the executor of JSIDS. And this individual, you will see, also has some additional roles. So the executor of JSIDS, he's the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. So down here in this note, you see what I explained, what the JROC is. Joint Requirements Oversight Council Board analyzes the gaps and provides recommendation. So the board, the council here, is the one that's actually looking at the .mlpf I discussed up here. But the actual person in charge of JSIDS, the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So hopefully I didn't confuse that too much. So if you see my note next to the vice chairman here, he's the executor of JSIDS right here. He's the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, and the JROC is the one that helps him to do these analysis. And guess what? The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is also the vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board. So in the acquisition system, remember JSIDS, PBE, and Defense Acquisition System. So even though the vice chairman is the executor of JSIDS, he also sits here on the Defense Acquisition Board in this system to make sure that everything stays in line with the national security strategy. And you have the chairman that participates in the PBE system. And we're going to show you that right here. Now we're into the resourcing piece of it. So once we know what our capability gaps are, we identify what is going to take to fix it. So some of the resources must just be, okay, we need funding. So we enter the PBE process. Or it may be a trigger from the .mlpf that we need to enter the acquisition system, which is the third one. So the trigger in the .mlpf that will send you to the acquisition system is if they determine, so JROC, the board, and the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, if they determine that the solution to fill the gap is a material, the M, material solution, we need better vehicles, we need new aircraft. If it's a material solution in the JCIDS, this is what triggers the acquisition system. But we'll talk about acquisition in a little bit. So let's move to the PPBE. Planning, programming, budgeting, and execution. Determine how to pay to fill the capability gap. So again, remember that circle, those three circles overlapping. Because even if it's a doctrine problem or we need more personnel, guess what? You still have to enter the PPBE system to determine how you're going to resource it. So remember, operational chain of command runs from the president right here to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders. So when it comes to the PPBE process, here's how it goes. The combatant commanders identify what their requirements are. Based on what their area of responsibility is, they will then determine what they need. So they issue or submit an IPL, Integrated Priority List. That is the document that the combatant commanders submit to tell their higher, and it says right here, they send it to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. That's your senior military advisor, the president, the secretary of defense, and the National Security Council, your secretary of defense, deputy SecDef, and the military department. So you might say, well, why does the combatant commanders have to send a notice or a heads up to the military department? Well, depending on what capability those combatant commanders need, it may be an Army asset or a Navy or an Air Force, a Marine asset that they need. So they want to give the heads up to these military department on what is necessary. So that's why a copy of the IPL goes to 1, 2, 3, 4 sections. So the IPL is then goes to the chairman. Again, if your subject matter expert in the military for the government is the chairman, he needs to review anything coming from the military. Makes sense. So the chairman then does his assessment. He looks at what we submit as the combatant commanders and then provides an assessment and recommendation of the IPLs. They want him, the chairman is responsible for making sure that what we're requesting is in line with the priorities already established by the SecDef in the national security document to ensure that we meet this national security strategy. So the national military strategy is developed is once the chairman is a top military guy in the government, he then has to develop the national military strategy. We know what the national security strategy is. You can look at this as a defense strategy, what the DoD's posture is going to be defense-wide, and that's defense of our country, homeland, overseas, and then specific to the military, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the author, writer of the National Military Strategy. So we do not get policy guidance directly from the chairman. He submits the National Military Strategy and his recommendation to the Secretary of Defense. Then the Secretary of Defense, the one we get our fiscal guidance, policy guidance from, will develop quadrennial defense reviews, strategic guidance, homeland and defense. So all the different defense strategy documents necessary, all of these documents combine to make the defense strategy to meet the national security strategy. So this should be making more sense to you as we go through. All right, so let's talk about the planning phase of PEB. Right here, you see the Responsibility of the planning phase of P falls under the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the USDP. The planning phase is when we start to develop the plan to meet that national security strategy. Remember the big op order. Everything that we do must be in line with meeting the NSS. So what this is saying here, the final document. So remember, there's a lot of integral things going on before you come to the final document. Kind of like if you have to write an evaluation report and you think, oh yeah, you did an awesome job writing up this report. Then it goes to another section, another board, another person, and they mark it up and send it back. So understand, although I don't have it all depicted here, there's a series of steps that goes through the planning phase. But the bottom line, the final document that is published in the planning phase of PEB is the Defense Planning Guidance. Now, you may also hear the word Defense Planning and Programming Guidance. So if you hear that, that is the same thing. Because here you're getting your programming guidance from the Director of CAPE and the USD for Comptroller, Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller. They issue guidance for the POM and the budget estimate submission. Before we start developing the POM, before we start developing the budget, we need to receive guidance. So in red here, you see we receive guidance from the DCAPE and the USDC. Well, why do we receive guidance from those two individuals? Let's look at the next part. The programming phase is the responsibility of this guy right here. So hence, he's giving you guidance on the POM. The Director of CAPE is responsible for the programming. Programming phase of PEB translate to allocation of resources. Now we need to prioritize on resources in the PPBE programming phase. And so we received our guidance here along with the defense planning guidance. POM and budget guidance is received here. So defense planning guidance or defense planning and programming guidance is what you may see. So again, starting back with your combatant commanders, they submit any programming requirements to the component commanders for inclusion in the POM. What that means is your combatant commanders do not submit their own POM requests. So they submitted their requirements earlier, but when it comes to actually getting it in the POM process, they have to submit their requirements, once approved, to the component commanders for inclusion in their POM. So again, if it's an Army requirement, the Army will include the needs of the combatant commanders in their POM. Same thing happened once it goes to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff here. That chairman does his assessment and provides a recommendation to the Secretary of Defense. So understand though, before it gets to the SecDef, it's going through various boards, 3-star group, small group, SecDef, large group. It's going through different boards, levels of board before it gets, you think about it, before it gets to the commander or the commanding general, you have a lot of sub-individuals who review the document. That's what's saying. What I want to point out here is the introduction of the Future Year Defense Program, FYDP, FYDP, however you want to call it. The Future Year Defense Program is the DoD database to keep track of all the information that's going backwards, forwards, up, down, what's submitted to hire in this whole PPBE process. So the keeper or the executor or the one that is responsible for the updating the Future Year Defense Program is the Director of CAPE, the same guy that issue our POM guidance, same guy responsible for the programming phase of PEB, Director of CAPE, updates the Future Year Defense Program. And this update continues through this whole process. So once the POM is then reviewed by these groups and approved. They go through their issue resolution if they have issues with it. Simultaneously, you have the budgeting phase. So that's why over here you receive guidance for the POM and the budget at the same time, because the programming phase will overlap with your budgeting phase. And they're different timelines, but you know we do the budget every year. So while you're working on the programming phase, your plan, yeah, you remember the PBE class. All right, so who's responsible for the budgeting phase? The Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller is responsible for the budgeting phase of P. The purpose of the budgeting phase is, now that we know what our resources and our programs are, we want to translate the programs into appropriations, because we're getting ready to request funding from Congress, and we need to ask for the funding in the appropriation format that Congress recognized. So we need to translate those programs into appropriations. So in the budgeting phase, the sequence is the same. Combatant commanders submit their budget requirements for inclusion in the BEST to those component commanders. The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff does his commander's assessment and recommendation of the budget estimate submission, your BEST. You still have those groups reviewing your budget. And the director of CAPE also updates the Future Year Defense Program. What I want to also bring to your attention is, in the budgeting phase, there's a comptroller information system right here that is also updated. So on the budgeting side, they're not only updating the Future Year Defense Program by this guy over here, the comptroller information system is updated with the budget information. The final document then, that's once DoD has done their backwards, forwards, reviews, issue resolution, that information that is getting ready to be sent upwards to the Office of Management and Budget is the Resource Management Decision, the RMDs. So at the end of the programming, at the end of the budgeting phase, the final document is the RMD. So planning was the DPG, Defense Planning Guidance. The final document in programming and budgeting is the Resource Management Decision. And this just says that the Future Year Defense Program is updated at the same time with the final numbers as it goes forward. And the DoD will then submit their budget request to Office of Management and Budget for inclusion into the president's budget or the federal budget. So remember, our hire from DoD is OMB, Office of Management and Budget. So the president must submit the budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February of each year. So Congress, once Congress gets the funding, there's a few things that once you do your studies, you'll see what happens. The Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, will gather all the information on the status of the country, the revenue, the deficit, outlay numbers, give it to Congress. Then Congress has to come up with the concurrent budget resolution. So all that means is both the House and the Senate have to determine what are going to be our guidelines. When we look at this president's budget, what are our restrictions? What are our offenses? What are our guidelines that we're going to be using? So once the concurrent budget resolution, which does not go to the president for signature, is settled, then the second phase of congressional action is the authorization process. So let me go back one. The concurrent budget resolution, not on the slide here, so I'm just using the slide as a means, and the same way you will do to help you with your studies, is you got to fill in the gap. So the concurrent budget resolution is the responsibility of the House and Senate Budget Committee. And then I said the second phase is the authorization phase. So which part of the Congress, the House and the Senate, is responsible for the authorization phase of congressional action? Well, that is the House and Senate Armed Services Committee. So remember that every action must go through the House and also approve on the Senate side. And so they must pass the bill in one similar form, a like form. So they have to agree. So the different committees will meet to hash out the budget or hash out the authorization process, and then they need to vote. So what is it called when the House and the Senate comes together to hash out their differences? The term used when the House and the Senate cannot agree and they have to come together in the middle to hash out their differences is called a conference committee. So in the conference committee, it doesn't matter how many people the House brings or the Senate brings. Bottom line is there's a single spokesperson for both groups, and they're there just to vote and make a decision on how they're going to vote. Because again, only one bill can go forward for the president to sign to become law. Another thing in the authorization process to remember is that in the authorization phase, Congress is only approving programs. It doesn't mean even if funding is associated with the programs, we do not get budget authority from the authorization phase. You can't spend money because they approve a program in the authorization phase. That's all I'm saying. So the third and final phase where we get our money is the appropriation phase. Now, two things happen. So the appropriation is approved. Not listed here, but something you should know once you're completed your studies. When Congress appropriates the money, it becomes law. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says I cannot get any money out of the Treasury unless I have an appropriation law. So once we get the appropriation law, two things happen. The first legal thing to happen is the Treasury issuing the Treasury warrant or appropriation warrant. So that's the first legal because it's tied into Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. The second thing that happened is Office of Management and Budget. Once they get notice back from Congress, President signs off on the budget, comes back to OMB, is for OMB to begin the apportionment process. And remember, apportionment is between OMB sending down to Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Education. So all those guys are apportioned their funding on the SF 132. Then the Department of Defense, when they get their apportionment, the DoD will give us allotments. So we're still in the execution phase now, who is the responsibility of the USD Comptroller, is the DoD issues allotment. And once we get our allotment, we begin to commit, obligate, and I'll use the word outlay because in this exam, I don't think I saw the word disbursement once. So they typically will talk about outlay, and the outlay is the definition used when the funding is removed from the Treasury to pay for a bill. So you monitor execution of the plan in the execution phase. As you notice, the budgeting and the execution phase of the PPBE is the responsibility of this guy, the USD Comptroller. So we have annual funding, MILPERS, O&M is 1 year, incremental funding, research, development, technology, and equipment, RDT&E are 2 year appropriations, full funding, procurement, and there's different type of procurements, and shipbuilding, Navy, and military construction are 5 year appropriations. All right, so that's the PPBE nutshell in short. So we talked about ACIDs giving us the capability gaps, PEB if we need to determine when we need to start asking for the money, all the resources. And then the third DoD system you see here is the Defense Acquisition System. That's how we either buy or develop the capability gap requirement that is necessary. So remember what I said, what triggered the acquisition system is back up here. If when the JROC is doing their analysis and they determine that the capability gap can be filled with a material solution, then it triggers the acquisition system. And remember, in the acquisition system is they don't just develop a brand new truck or a brand new aircraft. They need to also determine, okay, do we already have a similar type item in the inventory that we can just alter, change, adapt, or do we need to start a whole acquisition? So there's a lot of steps in this acquisition system. Let's look at what I have here. This is how you buy or develop what you need. So there's a board. The Defense Acquisition Board is the DoD senior forum for advising on any major defense acquisition system. So those are your ACAT 1 Delta or ACAT 1 AM. That's your information automation and systems for near-term needs. So the Defense Acquisition Board, just like you had the JROC board or council up here, in the Defense Acquisition System, you have the Defense Acquisition Board. The chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board is the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Is the chairman of the DAB. And here's this guy again. This is the same guy from up here. The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who I told you up at the top, is the executor of JCIT. So he knows what the capability gap was. He was there for the analysis. He is the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, and he's also the vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board right here with the Undersecretary of Defense, AT&L. So what he does, what the purpose of the vice chairman is to tie the long-range and near-term needs, long-range plan with your near-term needs. So this is the federal budget process in a nutshell. This is an awesome tool that I developed that you can use as you're studying. And as you see, I was filling in the gaps with the other things that occur in this process. If I couldn't fit it all, because then you really won't be able to recognize anything. This whole page will be just filled with information. So the purpose of this is to trigger the primary topics in the federal budget process to help you to better understand. So thank you, and I'll see you guys again next time.